It all began on a quiet street in a neighborhood that prided itself on perfectly trimmed lawns, sparkling driveways, and an unspoken agreement that everyone kept to the rules set by the homeowners association. Life there was calm, predictable, and orderly, exactly how most of the neighbors liked it. But for one resident, life was about to get a little more chaotic. And all because of a peculiar hobby that nobody in the neighborhood had ever seen before. The protagonist, an ordinary person with an extraordinary passion, had recently acquired an old airplane. It wasn't one of those shiny modern jets that people admired at airports. No, this plane was small, battered, and covered in layers of dust and peeling paint. The kind that made most people see it as nothing more than an abandoned relic from the past. But to the protagonist, it was a treasure. Every scratch told story. Every dent whispered memories of the skies it had once conquered. It was a piece of history, a project that required patience, love, and an understanding of machines that most people didn't possess. From the moment the plane arrived in the driveway, the neighbors could not stop talking about it. Some shook their heads, muttering about how ugly it looked. Others whispered their curiosity, peeking from behind curtains to get a better look. A few children even tried to climb near it, imagining it as a spaceship ready to take them to another world, but the protagonist didn't mind the attention. They knew that in a few months, with a little hard work, that junk plane, as they jokingly called it, would look magnificent again. Life continued normally for the protagonist. They spent hours each day cleaning, polishing, and carefully restoring parts of the plane. Sometimes they would talk to the plane as if it were a friend. "Don't worry," they would say, wiping the dirt off the wings. "You're going to shine again. And everyone will see how amazing you really are." It was a labor of love, and each day brought small victories. A polished propeller, a tightened bolt, a freshly painted panel. But not everyone in the neighborhood appreciated the charm of a vintage aircraft in someone's driveway. Karen, the president of the homeowners association, was one of those people. She was notorious for her strict enforcement of the rules, her sharp tongue, and her obsession with order. In her mind, everything had a place, and anything out of that place was a threat to the neighborhood's perfection. When she first saw the plane, she was horrified. The thought of such a large, weathered object sitting in plain view disturbed her deeply. How could someone allow such an eyesore? She thought Karen was not the type to simply frown and move on. No, she was proactive in her mission to maintain the neighborhood's standards. She immediately began jotting down notes, making phone calls, and planning the next steps. Her friends in the HOA committee often called her a perfectionist, but Karen preferred to think of herself as the guardian of beauty and order. In her mind, if the neighborhood fell into chaos, it would be her responsibility. She would not let that happen, not on her watch. The neighbors quickly realized that Karen had noticed the plane. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you see what she did?" one neighbor said. "She's already taking notes about that." "Thing in the driveway?" Another chuckled. "Thing? You mean the old plane? It's amazing. I've never seen anything like it." But Karen ignored their comments. To her, the opinions of casual onlookers didn't matter. What mattered was rules, appearances, and absolute control over the neighborhood environment. Over the next few days, Karen kept a close eye on the protagonist's property. She would walk past slowly, arms crossed, peering suspiciously at every bolt and panel. Sometimes she would take pictures, meticulously documenting every angle, as if building a case for a trial. The protagonist, on the other hand, continued with their work, completely unaware of the brewing storm. They waved politely at Karen whenever she passed by, hoping to maintain a friendly, neighborly connection. But Karen's eyes never left the plane. The protagonist tried to engage with other neighbors, sharing stories about the plane's history. "This is a 1940s training aircraft," they explained to anyone who would listen. "It's seen decades of adventure, and now it's my turn to restore it." Some neighbors were fascinated, asking questions about the engine, the wings, and the cockpit. Children loved hearing about how pilots once flew these small planes across the skies, imagining themselves steering through clouds. But Karen was not impressed. To her, It didn't matter if the plane was historic or educational. It was still an eyesore, and rules were rules. One afternoon, the protagonist received a polite knock at the door. Standing there was a few members of the HOA board, led by Karen. They didn't smile. They didn't make small talk. Their expressions were serious, almost accusing. Karen spoke first, her tone sharp and authoritative. "We need to discuss that airplane in your driveway. It is clearly against HOA regulations. You must remove it immediately." The protagonist was taken aback. "Remove it? But it's a historic plane." "I'm restoring it. It doesn't violate any city codes, and it's perfectly safe here. I've been careful not to disturb anyone." Karen shook her head. "That may be true legally, but it's an eyesore. It lowers property values and disturbs the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. You have 7 days to remove it, or we will take action." The protagonist felt a mixture of frustration and disbelief. How could something so meaningful to them be seen as nothing more than an ugly object? They tried to reason with Karen, offering to partially screen the plane with temporary fencing or a tarp. But Karen was unmoved. "No excuses," she said. "It stays out of sight, or it's gone." Word of the conflict spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about the audacity of the HOA's demands. Some felt sympathy for the protagonist, admiring their dedication to preserving history. Others, quietly, supported Karen, believing that rules were rules, and anyone who flouted them deserved consequences. Meanwhile, the protagonists continued their work, secretly hoping that Karen would change her mind or that some compromise could be reached. Days passed, and the tension grew. Karen continued her daily inspections, clipboard in hand, ready to report any infraction. The protagonist worked tirelessly, polishing, tightening, and adjusting the plane, hoping that the beauty of their work might soften Karen's rigid stance. They even invited a few neighbors to come see the progress, explaining the significance of each part and the meticulous care involved. Some neighbors were impressed. Others remained neutral. But Karen? She was unmoved. One evening, the protagonist stood in the driveway, looking at the plane against the fading sunlight. The wings glimmered faintly, and the cockpit shone like a tiny jewel. They felt a surge of pride. This plane was more than metal and bolts. It was history, passion, and dedication all in one. And yet they knew that Karen's determination posed a real threat. They couldn't let their labor of love be destroyed so easily. Little did the protagonists know. Karen's next move would escalate the situation far beyond simple neighborhood disputes. The junk plane in the driveway was about to become the center of a conflict that nobody in the neighborhood could ignore. Rules, pride, and stubbornness were about to collide in a way that would surprise everyone, including the protagonist, the neighbors, and even Karen herself. As night fell, the plane rested quietly in the driveway. Unaware of the storm it had unintentionally brought, the protagonist went inside, determined to face whatever came next with patience, careful planning, and a hope that reason might yet prevail. Outside, Karen plotted, determined to enforce the rules, confident that she was doing the right thing, and completely unaware that this was only the beginning of a very unusual and chaotic story. And so, the quiet street, once peaceful and orderly, braced itself for an unlikely clash between passion and perfection, between history and rules, between a small, battered plane and the iron will of HOA Karen. The tension in the neighborhood grew stronger by the day. The protagonist woke up each morning to find Karen already pacing the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, staring at the plane as if it were a criminal caught red-handed. The protagonist tried to ignore her, focusing on the restoration work, but it was impossible not to notice the sharp eyes that followed every movement. Even small victories, like polishing a wing or fixing a cracked panel, seemed to irritate Karen more. At first, the protagonists tried diplomacy. They knocked on Karen's door, hoping for a conversation that might ease the conflict. "Karen," they said politely, "I understand your concern, but this is a historic airplane. It's not dangerous, and I'm taking every precaution too. Keep it safe and neat. Could we find a compromise?" Karen's response was immediate and firm. "There is no compromise. The rules are clear. The plane cannot stay here. 7 days. Remove it, or face the consequences. Her tone left no room for discussion. The protagonist felt a tight knot form in their stomach. 7 days seemed impossibly short to relocate or hide such a large object. The neighbors were beginning to notice the drama. Some felt sympathy for the protagonist, admiring their dedication to preserving history. One neighbor, an elderly man who had once flown small planes, walked over to the driveway one afternoon. "You know, this plane has real character," he said quietly. "It's not just junk. It tells a story." The protagonist smiled, grateful for the support. But across the street, Karen's supporters whispered, "Rules are rules. Doesn't matter what story it tells." The protagonist tried another approach. They offered to partially cover the plane with a tarp or construct a temporary barrier to hide it from view. They even suggested moving it slightly to one side of the driveway. "Would that help?" they asked, trying to appeal to reason. Karen's eyes narrowed. "No, it is still visible. Still violates the HOA guidelines. I don't care what it means to you. It must go." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving the protagonist standing alone, feeling frustrated and powerless. As the days passed, the tension escalated. Karen sent official letters, more formal than before, warning of fines and legal action if the plane was not removed. The protagonist tried to comply without giving up their passion. They began calling storage facilities, thinking they could temporarily relocate the plane, but discovered that no place could accommodate an object so large, delicate, and unusual. Moving it without causing damage was almost impossible. The protagonist also researched HOA rules in detail, hoping to find a loophole. Everything they found suggested that while there were restrictions on vehicles, boats, and certain large objects, historic or personal restoration projects were not explicitly banned. Armed with this information, they prepared a polite but firm response to the HOA, explaining the legal status of the plane and requesting an exemption. Karen, however, was relentless. One morning, the protagonist noticed her standing near the driveway earlier than usual, speaking on the phone with an unmistakable intensity. She paced back and forth, occasionally pointing at the plane. The protagonist's heart sank. They knew she was plotting her next move. That evening, the protagonist received a notice from the HOA. A tow truck had been scheduled to remove the plane in just 3 days if it was not relocated. The words felt like a punch in the gut. All their work, all the hours spent restoring the plane, could be gone in a single morning. Panic and disbelief washed over them, but they quickly reminded themselves to stay calm. They began brainstorming ideas to prevent this disaster. The protagonist called a few friends who had experience with antique vehicles and restoration projects. "We need to protect this plane," they said urgently. "It's historic. It's valuable. It's going to be gone if we don't act." Friends offered advice. Some suggested calling the media to highlight the absurdity of the situation. Others recommended legal assistance. A few even suggested negotiating with Karen directly one last time. Meanwhile, Karen's confidence only grew. She believed she was doing the right thing for the community. "If I don't enforce the rules, who will?" she muttered to herself one afternoon, pacing along the sidewalk. "People have to understand that rules exist for a reason. That plane is a problem, and I will fix it." She had already made calls to the tow company, confirming the schedule, and discussing the logistics. She didn't consider the plane's history or the personal effort involved. In her mind, it was simply a violation, and that was enough. The neighborhood watched the drama unfold with a mix of shock and amusement. Some neighbors began placing bets on whether the plane would actually be removed or whether the protagonist would find a way to protect it. Children, oblivious to the full gravity of the situation, imagined secret missions to save the junk plane, whispering plans to one another about how they could sneak it into a hidden hangar. The protagonist tried every possible solution. They called storage facilities again, checked with local museums, and even reached out to aviation enthusiasts. No practical options were available. Moving the plane was difficult, expensive, and risky. Every day brought the looming threat of Karen's actions closer. Finally, just as hope began to dwindle, the protagonist received a call from a local aviation historian. "I heard about your project. the historian said. That plane may have more significance than anyone realizes, could even be part of an important aviation history investigation. The protagonist's eyes widened. This was the breakthrough they needed. If the plane had historical or investigative importance, it could not legally be removed or destroyed. Armed with this new information, the protagonist hurriedly prepared documents, photographs, and contact details to present to the HOA. They hoped to stop Karen before the tow truck arrived. Meanwhile, Karen continued her daily inspections, oblivious to the fact that her actions might soon be halted by something far bigger than HOA rules. On the morning the tow truck was scheduled to arrive, the protagonist stood in the driveway, tense but determined. Friends arrived to offer moral support, and a small crowd of curious neighbors gathered, whispering and speculating about what would happen. Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, radiating authority. "This is it," she said. "Firmly, the plane will be gone by noon." The tow truck driver, a burly man with little interest in neighborhood politics, approached the plane and began evaluating how to safely remove it. The protagonist politely interrupted. "Wait, there's new information. This plane may be part of an official historical investigation. I need to contact the authorities before anything happens." Karen raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Investigation? That doesn't matter. The rules are clear." But the tow truck driver hesitated. He didn't want to damage the plane or get in trouble with the law. The tension in the driveway was almost unbearable. The protagonist quickly made phone calls, connecting with aviation authorities and providing details about the plane's history and significance. Within an hour, official representatives arrived, asking for documentation and photographs. Karen's confident demeanor began to falter as she realized the situation might not be as simple as she thought. By the afternoon, the plane remained in the driveway. Authorities examined it carefully, speaking with the protagonist about its history and current restoration status. Karen watched, increasingly flustered, as it became clear that her planned removal had been halted. Her rigid control over the neighborhood had met an unexpected obstacle. She was visibly unsettled. For the protagonist, relief washed over them. Her hard work, patience, and passion had prevented disaster. The plane was safe for now. Neighbors cheered quietly, some with smiles of admiration, others with shocked disbelief at the turn of events. Children whispered excitedly about the secret mission that had saved the day. Karen, however, was not ready to give up entirely. She muttered under her breath about loopholes, fines, and regulations, convinced that she would find another way to assert her authority. But for the protagonist, this was a victory, proof that dedication and reason could sometimes overcome even the most stubborn enforcement of rules. As the day ended, the protagonist returned to the driveway, gently brushing dust off the wings. In reflecting on the chaotic week, the plane glinted in the late sunlight, a symbol of perseverance and unexpected triumph. They knew the battle was not over. Karen was still determined, and the neighborhood would continue to watch the drama unfold. But for now, the plane remained safe, standing proud as a testament to history, passion, and the courage to stand up to unnecessary authority. And so, the once quiet and orderly street had been transformed into a stage for an unexpected conflict between a determined hobbyist, a rigid HOA president, and a plane that was far more than just a junk plane. The story was only beginning, and the next chapter promised even more surprises, challenges, and revelations that no one, not even Karen, could have predicted. The calm of the neighborhood had been shattered, and now a different kind of tension filled the air. The protagonist felt a mix of relief and anticipation after the authorities' visit. But they knew that the situation with Karen was far from over. Karen was relentless, and her stubbornness had only grown stronger since the failed attempt to tow the plane. She spent hours on the sidewalk, eyes fixed on the driveway, muttering about rules and fines, determined to find another way to make the plane disappear. Meanwhile, the protagonist learned more from the aviation authorities who had arrived. They discovered that the plane might be connected to a federal crash investigation from several years ago. It was not just an old, abandoned aircraft. It had been part of a small investigation that had never been fully resolved. The authorities, explained that every part of the plane, even small pieces that seemed broken or useless, could contain important clues. This revelation transformed the plane from a simple restoration project, into a significant historical and investigative artifact. The protagonist's heart raced. Suddenly, their project wasn't just about personal passion, it had potential national importance. The protagonist began documenting everything meticulously. They photographed every panel, every crack, every small part of the fuselage. Took notes on the plane's condition, making careful records that could help investigators. Every day became a careful routine. Maintenance in the morning, documentation in the afternoon, and careful observation at dusk to ensure Karen wasn't plotting another move. Friends and neighbors offered help, and soon a small team had formed around the protagonist. One friend, an aviation engineer, even brought specialized tools to help preserve fragile parts. Karen, however, seemed unfazed by the new developments. She continued issuing warnings and sending letters filled with legal jargon, insisting that the plane violated HOA rules. She even began holding small meetings with neighbors, trying to gather support for her cause. "This is about safety. In order," she declared at one meeting. "We cannot allow this plane to remain here. Rules are rules and everyone must follow them." The protagonist watched from a distance, realizing that reasoning with Karen was futile. Her determination was not based on facts, but on her own sense of authority. One day, while the protagonist was carefully cleaning the plane, they noticed a small, almost hidden panel on the underside that seemed unusual. It was curious. They opened it and discovered a set of old documents and notes hidden inside. The documents appeared to be official reports from the original crash investigation, including photographs, witness statements, and even technical schematics. The protagonist realized that these papers could hold critical information for the UA authorities. They carefully collected the documents and contacted the aviation historian who had previously helped them. The historian was astonished. "This could be huge," he said. "These documents may contain clues that were missed years ago. You might have just uncovered a missing piece of an important investigation." The protagonist felt a mix of pride and anxiety. On one hand, they were thrilled to have discovered something significant. On the other hand, they knew that Karen would likely escalate her actions once she learned the plane's importance. True to form, Karen soon learned about the new developments. A neighbor who had overheard a phone call informed her that authorities were now taking the plane seriously. Karen's face turned red with anger. She stormed over to the driveway, waving her hands. "This changes nothing," she shouted. "The rules are clear. That plane cannot stay. I will not be ignored by some so-called authorities." The protagonist tried to stay calm. "Karen, I understand your concern, but this is now a matter for federal investigators. Removing or damaging the plane could have serious legal consequences. Please, let us handle this properly." Karen's eyes narrowed. "I don't care. This is my neighborhood, and I will enforce the rules. You think some papers change anything? They don't." Neighbors watched the confrontation in stunned silence. Some felt sympathy for the protagonist, understanding that the stakes were far higher than Karen realized. Others were curious about the documents and the potential investigation. Children peeked from behind fences, whispering to each other about secret planes and hidden papers. The neighborhood had become a stage for a real-life drama that no one could ignore. As the tension grew, the protagonist worked tirelessly to prepare the plane for official examination. They stabilized fragile parts, carefully cataloged every document, and even began creating a small protective barrier around the plane to prevent accidental damage. Friends rotated shifts to keep watch, knowing that Karen could attempt another aggressive move at any time. The atmosphere was a mix of excitement, anxiety, and determination. Then came the breakthrough. A federal aviation investigator arrived unexpectedly, having learned about the plane through the historian. They examined the plane thoroughly, taking notes, photographs, and even small samples from areas that appeared significant. The protagonist watched closely, feeling a mix of awe and relief. For the first time, someone in authority had recognized the plane's true value. Karen, however, was incensed. She demanded explanations, citing HOA rules and neighborhood regulations, but the investigator politely but firmly explained that federal law took precedence. "This plane is now part of an official investigation," they said. "No action may be taken to remove or damage it without authorization." Karen's frustration was palpable. She muttered under her breath and paced the sidewalk, but she could not argue with federal authority. The neighbors, sensing the shift in power, began quietly supporting the protagonist, offering assistance and moral encouragement. Children brought small snacks and water, wanting to help in their own little ways, while adults helped with documentation and logistics. The protagonist realized that the situation had become bigger than just a single person or a single plane. It had transformed the neighborhood into a hub of history, curiosity, and civic responsibility. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation intensified. Experts analyzed the documents, studied the plane's structure, and began piecing together new insights into the old crash. The protagonist remained deeply involved, providing information, guiding experts through the restoration work, and ensuring that nothing was damaged or disturbed. Every day brought new discoveries, from small mechanical insights to potentially critical clues about the crash itself. The plane was no longer just a hobby project. It had become a key part of uncovering the truth behind a long-forgotten incident. Karen, despite her anger, began to face reality. She could no longer influence the situation in the same way. Her daily inspections and warnings were ignored by the authorities, and her letters went unanswered. Slowly, some of her supporters began to question her priorities, realizing that the protagonist was contributing to something far larger than personal preferences or HOA rules. The neighborhood's perspective was shifting. Karen's control over the narrative was slipping. Amid the tension, moments of human connection emerged. The protagonist bonded with the aviation experts, learning small details about flight, mechanics, historical aviation practices, and restoration techniques. Neighbors became invested in the story, often visiting to watch the plane, ask questions, and offer support. Even the children, who had initially seen the plane as a mysterious object, began learning about history, science, and the importance of perseverance. The plane had transformed into a living classroom, a symbol of curiosity, diligence, and community spirit. One evening, the protagonist sat quietly next to the plane, reflecting on the journey so far. From a simple restoration project to a federal investigation, the experience had been overwhelming but rewarding. They realized that patience, persistence, and careful action had been the keys to protecting the plane and uncovering its hidden importance. Karen remained a looming presence, but for the first time, her authority seemed limited. Constrained by facts, law, and the growing support of the neighborhood, the climax of Part 3 came unexpectedly. The federal investigator called the protagonist to a nearby office. "We've reviewed everything," the investigator said. "This plane contains crucial evidence. It will be transported to a secure facility for further analysis. Your role has been invaluable in preserving it. Without your care and dedication, this evidence might have been lost." The protagonist felt a surge of pride and relief. Months of effort, patience, and vigilance had paid off. The plane was finally recognized for what it truly was, not junk, not a violation, but a vital piece of history, as the plane was carefully prepared for transport. Karen watched from the sidewalk, silent for the first time in weeks. Her attempts to enforce HOA rules had failed, and the authorities' involvement had made it clear that her power was limited. The neighborhood had witnessed a remarkable transformation, a symbol of perseverance, the triumph of reason over stubbornness, and the power of collective support. The protagonist waved goodbye to the plane as it was loaded onto a trailer, feeling a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. The adventure was far from over. The investigation would continue, but they knew that their dedication had made a real difference. Karen, now forced to confront reality, retreated to her house, while the neighborhood slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. But the story of the junk plane would be remembered for years, a tale of passion, determination, and the unexpected ways that history can reveal itself. And so, Part 3 ended with the protagonist triumphant, the plane recognized as important, and the neighborhood forever changed. The next chapter promised further revelations, challenges, unexpected twists as the investigation unfolded, and Karen's stubbornness found new ways to clash with the truth. Asterisk. After the plane was carefully transported to the secure facility, the neighborhood seemed quieter, but the tension was far from over. The protagonist returned home, feeling both relief and curiosity. While the plane was no longer in the driveway, its importance had grown exponentially, and the protagonist knew that the story was entering a new, more intense phase. They had uncovered hidden documents, aided federal investigators, and stood up to Karen. But now the real investigation, the deep dive into the crash, was just beginning. The following days were filled with calls, emails, and visits from aviation experts. The protagonist was frequently asked to provide clarifications about specific details of the plane, its condition, and the documents they had discovered. Every time a question was answered, the investigation seemed to inch closer to uncovering long-hidden truths. Each conversation revealed how much care and attention the protagonist had given to the plane. Their meticulous records were invaluable, and the investigators praised their patience and foresight. Karen, however, was not idle. She seemed more determined than ever to assert her authority over the neighborhood. She circulated more letters, attended local council meetings, and tried to rally support from other residents who might have felt uneasy about the plane and the federal involvement. "This is our community," she declared, waving papers she had printed herself. "We cannot allow outsiders to take over. This is not just about a plane, it's about control, respect, and the rules we all agreed to." At the community's mood had shifted. Neighbors who once hesitated to speak against her now politely but firmly pointed out that the authorities were in charge, and no HOA rules could override federal law. Karen's frustration was growing, and her confidence seemed to waver, though only slightly. Meanwhile, the protagonist received an unexpected invitation. A senior investigator requested their presence at the secure facility. The investigator wanted to show them the latest findings and discuss what had been discovered from the plane and the documents. The protagonist felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. They had played a crucial role so far, but this visit promised to reveal the plane's true significance at the facility. The protagonist was guided through a series of rooms filled with other recovered aviation artifacts. The plane was placed in a large, temperature-controlled area, surrounded by experts examining its structure, components, and the documents that had been found. The investigator explained that the plane was linked to a crash that had been a mystery for years, with several unusual circumstances surrounding it. Evidence suggested that some technical failure had contributed to the crash, but other clues hinted at more complex issues that had never been explored. The protagonist could hardly believe what they were seeing. Every panel, every instrument, every piece of metal told a story. They watched as engineers carefully removed parts of the plane for detailed study, analyzing stress patterns, corrosion, and the unusual wear on the wings. Each small discovery was documented, photographed, and compared to the notes the protagonist had provided. The realization that they had directly contributed to a significant investigation filled them with pride, but also a sense of responsibility. As the examination progressed, the investigators uncovered something startling. Several small components had been deliberately tampered with long before the crash. It appeared that the aircraft had been modified in ways that were not immediately obvious, potentially contributing to the accident. This revelation added a new layer of intrigue. The crash was no longer a simple mechanical failure. It might have involved intentional human error or negligence. The implications were serious, and the investigation took on an urgency that the protagonist had not anticipated. Back in the neighborhood, Karen continued her attempts to regain control. She appeared at the protagonist's driveway unannounced, demanding answers. "I want to know what's happening. I will not allow my neighborhood to be ignored while some plane takes over our lives." The protagonist calmly explained that the plane was under federal protection and that any interference could result in serious legal consequences. Karen's face twisted in anger, but she could not argue with the law. Her frustration was visible to neighbors who watched quietly from their windows, unsure if she would escalate her actions further. The protagonist, despite the ongoing tension, also had to manage their personal life. The investigation demanded attention, but everyday responsibilities continued. Work, family, and errands had to be balanced with the constant communication with the authorities. Friends offered support, helping with errands, watching over the neighborhood, and assisting in any way they could. The protagonist realized that the ordeal had become a community effort, with each small act contributing to the protection of something much larger than themselves. One evening, a breakthrough came through the analysis of the documents found inside the plane. A hidden note, partially obscured and faded with age, contained information that linked the crash to a possible cover-up. The note suggested that certain maintenance issues had been ignored intentionally, and some communications about the aircraft's condition had been altered or lost. Investigators were stunned. This small, overlooked detail could rewrite the history of the crash and explain inconsistencies that had puzzled experts for years. The protagonist felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They realized that their discovery had not only saved important evidence, but also had the potential to expose truths that powerful people might have wanted hidden. The responsibility was immense. Every decision, every detail documented, could have serious consequences. Yet despite the pressure, they remained focused, determined to support the investigation fully. Karen, sensing the growing significance of the plane, tried to exploit the situation. She spoke to a few neighbors, claiming that the investigation was an overreach and that the neighborhood's rules were being ignored. "This is about keeping our community safe and respected," she said repeatedly, but her arguments fell flat. The neighbors who had supported the protagonist now openly defended them, explaining that the plane and the investigation were beyond Karen's authority. Her influence waned, and the community's support for the protagonist grew stronger. Meanwhile, the investigators requested that the protagonist provide more detailed records about the plane's current condition before transport. They needed exact measurements, photographs from multiple angles, and notes on any potential hazards. The protagonist and their friends spent days meticulously documenting everything, creating organized files that would help the experts in further analysis. Each task was performed with care and precision, understanding that even a small oversight could compromise the investigation. As the investigation unfolded, the protagonist also began learning more about aviation safety and history. They studied past crash reports, maintenance manuals, and aviation regulations. Conversations with the experts offered insights into the complexity of aircraft mechanics, the importance of proper documentation, and the critical role of ethics in aviation. Every lesson reinforced the protagonist's belief that their vigilance and attention had been vital to preserving the plane and its hidden history. Karen, increasingly desperate, tried one last attempt to disrupt the process. She confronted the protagonist directly, this time threatening legal action against anyone involved in the investigation. Claiming property violations and neighborhood trespassing, the protagonist calmly responded that all actions were legal, documented, and coordinated with authorities. Karen's threats had no effect. The neighbors, who had grown used to her antics, quietly but firmly, made it clear that her interference was no longer welcome. Her influence had diminished, and the investigation continued without disruption. The climax of Part 4 arrived when the federal team uncovered a major revelation. The crash had been partially caused by deliberate tampering, and the chain of negligence had reached higher than anyone expected. The discovery was shocking, and the investigators realized that this could lead to legal and historical implications. The protagonist, who had preserved the plane and its documents with painstaking care, had unknowingly played a crucial role in solving a mystery that had remained unresolved for decades. In the neighborhood, life began to settle into a cautious rhythm. The protagonist's role as the guardian of the plane had ended, but the experience left a lasting impression on the community. Neighbors had witnessed the power of persistence, careful observation, and dedication to truth. Children learned lessons about history and responsibility, and adults were reminded of the importance of standing firm in the face of irrational opposition. Karen, meanwhile, retreated, frustrated but powerless to change the course of events. By the end of Part 4, the protagonist had grown in ways they never anticipated. What began as a simple hobby of restoring a plane had evolved into a critical investigation with national significance. They had faced stubborn opposition, navigated legal and bureaucratic hurdles, and preserved evidence that uncovered hidden truths. The plane, now secured and under expert care, symbolized not just history and mystery, but also the triumph of diligence, courage, and integrity over fear, ignorance, stubbornness. The stage was now set for the final part of the story, where the full consequences of the investigation would unfold. Karen's antics would reach their ultimate peak, and the protagonist's journey would reach a dramatic and satisfying conclusion. The story had transformed from a neighborhood dispute into a saga of discovery, persistence, and justice, leaving the community forever changed and the protagonist ready for the final revelations that awaited. The investigation had reached a critical stage. The plane, once a mere curiosity in the protagonist's driveway, had transformed into the centerpiece of a complex federal inquiry. Experts had carefully analyzed every panel, bolt, and piece of metal. The documents and hidden notes uncovered earlier had begun to tell a story no one had anticipated. It was no longer just about a plane or an HOA dispute. It was about truth, responsibility, and the courage of one ordinary person who refused to back down. The protagonist awoke one morning to a flurry of messages from the federal investigators. They wanted an urgent meeting to discuss the latest findings, excitement mixed with nervousness. Weeks of waiting, documenting, and protecting the plane had led to this moment. With meticulous care, the protagonists gathered all the files, photos, and notes they had prepared over the months. Every detail might be important. Every observation could be the key to solving the mystery that had remained unresolved for decades. At the secure facility, the protagonist met the team of experts. Engineers, aviation historians, and legal specialists were all present. The room was filled with a quiet intensity. Everyone understood the importance of the information at hand. The lead investigator explained that their analysis had revealed the full story behind the crash was more complicated than anyone had imagined. The aircraft had not just suffered mechanical failure, it had been intentionally sabotaged. Negligence by multiple parties had compounded the problem. Some of the individuals involved had attempted to cover up their mistakes, which explained why the crash had remained a mystery for so long. The protagonist listened intently, amazed at how much impact their preservation of the plane and documents had on the investigation. Without their care and attention, crucial evidence would have been lost, and the truth might never have been discovered. The lead investigator even remarked that the protagonist's actions likely prevented further misunderstandings and preserved historical accuracy. For someone who had only wanted to restore an old plane, this was an extraordinary compliment. While the protagonist was at the facility, news of the investigation reached their neighborhood. Karen, now increasingly desperate, sensed that the plane's significance had grown beyond her control. She made one final attempt to intimidate the protagonist and other neighbors. She stormed into the community meeting waving papers and shouting about neighborhood rules, property rights, and supposed conspiracies. "I will not allow outsiders to take over our community," she screamed. But this time, her audience had changed. The neighbors who had quietly supported her before now spoke up firmly. They told her that the authorities were in charge, that the plane and the investigation were legal, and that her interference could lead to serious consequences. Karen's anger was palpable, but her power had vanished. She left the meeting fuming, realizing that she could no longer control the narrative. Meanwhile, back at the facility, the protagonist was asked to participate in a demonstration. The investigators wanted to show how the sabotage had been carried out. Using models, diagrams, and detailed replicas, they explained exactly how small modifications and overlooked maintenance had caused a chain reaction leading to the crash. The protagonist was struck by how small errors and intentional tampering could have such devastating consequences. It made them realize how fragile safety could be, and how important vigilance and responsibility were. The investigation also revealed the involvement of a few high-ranking individuals who had tried to cover up their mistakes. Their actions, motivated by fear, pride, or financial concerns, had prevented earlier resolutions and allowed the truth to remain hidden for years. This revelation sent shockwaves through the aviation community and hinted at potential legal proceedings. The protagonists realized that their role had been far more significant than they had imagined. Their careful records, photographs, and observations were now a central piece of evidence that might hold key individuals accountable during this period. The protagonists also reflected on their personal growth. They had faced harassment, legal uncertainty, and the relentless efforts of Karen, yet they had remained patient, methodical, and focused. They had learned lessons about persistence, courage, and the power of community. Friends and neighbors who had supported them during the ordeal became an essential part of this journey. Their help, whether in documenting details, providing moral support, or defending the protagonist against Karen, had been invaluable. The ordeal had forged a strong bond among those who believed in truth and fairness. The climax of Part 5 arrived. When the investigators uncovered the final piece of evidence, a hidden logbook, stored in a compartment of the plane, contained direct entries about the aircraft's maintenance and modifications. The logbook confirmed that sabotage had occurred and provided names, dates, and specific actions. This discovery was the smoking gun that connected all the scattered clues into a coherent story. The protagonist's meticulous records helped verify the logbook's authenticity and timeline. It was the final link needed to close decades-old questions and finally tell the full story of the crash. Once the evidence was fully verified, the investigators arranged a press conference to announce their findings. The protagonist was invited to attend, though they were nervous about the public attention. When the day arrived, reporters, neighbors, and aviation experts filled the room. The lead investigator explained the details of the crash, the sabotage, and the cover-up, highlighting the crucial role played by the person who had preserved the plane and its documents. The protagonist felt a mix of pride, relief, and disbelief. They had only wanted to save an old aircraft, but their actions had now become a matter of national significance. The press conference also addressed the impact on the neighborhood. The authorities emphasized that the plane had been protected under federal law and that any interference by HOA members or others could have resulted in serious penalties. Karen's name was not mentioned directly, but the implications were clear. Her repeated attempts to assert control had been ineffective, and the community now understood that truth and legality could not be overridden by personal stubbornness. After the public announcement, the protagonist returned home to a neighborhood that had changed forever. Neighbors came by to offer congratulations, share stories, and express pride in the protagonist's courage. Children were curious about the plane and the investigation, asking questions about how things worked and why. The protagonist had cared so much. The protagonist shared what they had learned, explaining the importance of responsibility, attention to detail, and standing up for what was right. Even when it was difficult, Karen, realizing that her influence had completely diminished, quietly retreated from public view. Her attempts to manipulate the situation, intimidate neighbors, and regain control were no longer taken seriously. Some residents continued to avoid her, while others felt pity for her stubbornness and inability to adapt. The protagonist, however, focused on moving forward, understanding that some people resist change. No matter how clear the truth becomes, the protagonist also took time to reflect on the lessons learned throughout the ordeal. They had discovered the importance of patience, careful observation, and persistence. They had seen firsthand how community support, when combined with courage and truth, could overcome harassment, manipulation, and stubborn opposition. The experience had transformed them from a simple plane enthusiast into someone capable of making a real difference in uncovering history and protecting the truth. In the final days of the investigation, the plane was carefully stored in a permanent facility, designed for long-term preservation. Experts continued to study its parts and documents, ensuring that every detail was cataloged for future research. The protagonist remained involved in a consulting role, providing insights and answering questions about the plane's condition and history. Her contribution ensured that the plane's story would be accurately preserved for generations to come. By the end of Part 5, The protagonists had fully realized the scope of their journey. What began as a frustrating encounter with an overbearing HOA member had evolved into a historic investigation, covering truths that had remained hidden for decades. Karen's efforts to assert control had ultimately failed, and the community had rallied around the protagonist, recognizing their integrity and perseverance. The plane, once a forgotten relic in a driveway, had become a symbol of vigilance, courage, and the triumph of truth over stubbornness and ignorance. The story concluded. With the protagonist feeling a sense of closure and accomplishment, the investigation had ended, the plane was secure, and the neighborhood had returned to a cautious peace. The protagonist knew that life would continue with new challenges, but the lessons learned during this extraordinary experience would guide them forever. They had proven that careful attention, courage, and dedication could turn an ordinary person into a guardian of history, capable of preserving truth even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, the plane was more than metal, an instrument. It was a testament to perseverance, the value of truth, and the power of standing firm against irrational authority. The protagonist's journey showed that ordinary people, when willing to act with integrity and determination, could impact history in ways that no one might expect. The neighborhood had changed. Karen had lost her influence, and the truth had finally prevailed.